Hi, everybody. So, I've recently come to the conclusion that many people don't believe that consent is necessary. They do believe in force. And so, I'm going to discuss the illegitimacy of procreation in the state because both institutions are based on force. And so, this is why I am both an anti-natalist and an anarchist because I don't believe that any society or social contract is legitimate unless it is voluntary. If it's based on force, then you basically don't have any duties to maintain these institutions. So many people do believe that force is legitimate, right? They don't believe in trying to convince people with the strength of their arguments. They believe that they're just going to impose their will either through procreation or through the state. They're going to use violence. They're going to create a human being without their consent because they feel entitled to that just because they have the power to do it. Whether it is right does not matter. Whether the person consented is not does not matter. I've already addressed the non-identity problem that a person who doesn't exist can't give consent. But my framework is a little bit different. If you have read my book, I talk about unjust enrichment. But nevertheless, people have power, right? So that's how they act. They act based on power. They have the power to procreate. They have the power to impose their will through the state. And so that's all that matters, right? Never mind the fiction of democracy is supposed to be based on consent. Never mind the fact that they say that life is a gift. Never mind the fact that they claim that we all have free will. So, my position, which is why I'm both an anti-natalist and an anarchist, is that consent is the only coherent basis by which any arrangement between human beings can claim moral authority. If it's not based on moral authority, then it's just naked violence. And that to me, that is not legitimate. If I did not consent, then I don't have any duties or obligations. Now, let me start out with Rousseau. Rousseau gave us two foundational statements about the family. The family is the only natural society, it is the first society. The family is the original model from which all political authority derives its shape, its justification, and its legitimacy. This is the reason why the status position is decidedly pro-family, pro-life, because that is how you maintain the state, is through procreation, through the nuclear family. If you're going to dismantle the state, then you would necessarily need to go against these uh, these institutions, the pro-life institution, the institution of marriage and being an obedient citizen, right? So the family is a natural society because it is grounded in necessity. The child cannot survive without the parent. The child has a biological necessity to submit to the will of their parents because the child needs their parents for their survival, for their basic needs. But according to Rousseau, parental authority has a natural expiration date because the parent-child relationship is only natural and is only legitimate up until the point that the child becomes self-sufficient, right? After the child reaches adulthood and is self-sufficient, then it becomes a voluntary arrangement where you maintain a relationship with your parents if they were good to you, if they were not abusive. So you don't have a duty to maintain that relationship. That you don't have a natural duty. Your natural duty or sorry, your natural relationship is only when you are dependent on them. After that, then you are free to do whatever you want. This is contrary to what most parents believe, by the way. They believe that you have a lifelong obligation to submit to their will, even when you are an adult. They think that you should just do whatever they say. If you don't obey them, then you're somehow being disrespectful or ungrateful. So, even at the base level of the parent-child relationship, Rousseau has already placed consent at the foundation of legitimate social bonds. So he did create a juxtaposition between the family and the state. He says that the state is natural, the state is entirely conventional. The state does not arise from nature, but from a social contract. Let's see, I have some people here. Hello. And this is based on the purpose of authority, right? So the state is not a natural society. It needs actual justification, right? This is why he created the social contract. He believed that a properly formed contract did provide legitimacy to the state. I tend to disagree with Rousseau because he never explained how you consent to the social contract, especially if you're born into it. So the difference between the parent-child relationship and the state is that the family relationship, the natural family society, ends once you reach the age of majority, and therefore consent after that point must exist, right? Otherwise, it loses its legitimacy. You're not forced to be a member of your family after you become an adult. The state never reaches this point, right? You never really get independence from the state. There is no point at which the citizen is told that the necessity justifying state authority over them has dissolved and they are free to choose or not remain subject to the state. So according to Rousseau's framework, which I think there's some glaring contradictions, in order for the state to have any legitimacy, every state would have to release each citizen at adulthood and ask them to opt in voluntarily to make the social contract legitimate, right? But they don't give you a right to opt out. You're just born into it, and they just assume that you consented whether you did or not. No state would ever do this. No state actually asked you to opt into it. You're just born into it. So this is not natural authority. Most of it is based on appeals to necessity, misanthropic necessity, by the way, because they basically don't trust human beings. They don't trust themselves. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but consent is the barometer for any moral legitimacy. No arrangement imposed on a person without their agreement can claim moral authority over them, regardless of how beneficial, traditional, or widely accepted. Because all of these justifications are based on logical fallacies. They say, oh, well, most people agree to it. It benefits most people. Oh, you were born into it, so therefore it benefits you. You benefit from the state also because you receive protection from the state. I think these are illegitimate justifications. First, I did not choose to be born, so it's a false dichotomy anyway. The false dichotomy is either exist without the state or exist with the state, but I did not choose to exist in the first place. So the original imposition by my parents created the compounded harm of enslavement to the state, right? So that's why my framework is different from traditional anti-natalism. I'm not just addressing the original imposition of procreation. I'm also addressing the imposition of enslavement to the state. Actually, most of my book, I think only two chapters are talking about procreation. The rest is talking about what your life is like after procreation, that you spend your life enslaved to the state and to capitalism. Now let's talk about why force is not legitimate. Compelling someone demonstrates only the capacity to exercise force. not that the compulsion was right or that the arrangement was just. Legitimacy is a moral claim. It merely says that something happened, but it does not say that it ought to have happened. Force cannot create a moral claim. When consent is discarded over power, rights cease to exist as a moral category and become merely permissions granted by whoever is the strongest, right? Because the whole thing, according to Hobbes and, well, I would say Hobbes, he says that the state of nature is a will against all, and that basically it's just chaos. And so basically you need a state in order to protect people from themselves. But if it's just might makes right, then there's really is no different from that in a state of nature, right? You're just giving someone else a monopoly on violence, but the violence is still there. And so if the social contract is illegitimate because it's based on force, then the person who has obligations under the social contract has every reason and every incentive to defect the moment the force is not present. The cost of compliance drops below the cost of resistance. Investment in that social contract requires free choice. And it dissolves the moment the threat is dissolved. So power is the capacity to compel. Authority is the recognition by others that a direction has a legitimate claim on them, and authority cannot exist without consent. Without consent, trade becomes theft. Well, property becomes theft. Let's start with that. Governance becomes enslavement, and procreation becomes assault. It becomes an entire system of predation in which freedom is impossible. Force creates no legitimate responsibilities. It creates no legitimate duties. A person who was forced bears no legitimate responsibilities arising from that force. Now let's talk about illegitimate responsibility, because this is how it works in reality. An imposition was made. The imposition creates conditions. These conditions are then used to create apparent obligations enforced by guilt, law, social pressure, or violence, right? And the original imposition is procreation, the fact that you were born into a state. So because you were born into a state, now you have all of these duties to be a good person, to obey all of these laws, to be ethical. And these duties are the direct consequence of the previous illegitimate action. The original imposition is illegitimate because they did not have legitimate authority to correct you in the first place, or to put you under the state's authority, to put you in a society that you did not consent to. And so therefore, nothing that happens after that is legitimate, including duties to the state, duties to your parents. The child who disobeys his authoritarian parents does not have any legitimate authority or the child who disobeys his authoritarian parents does not have any legitimate duties to obey them in the first place, right? It goes beyond the scope of their authority as parents. If they're being abusive and they think that you should just submit to their will, they think that they own you, they think that you don't have a right to your own happiness, that you exist to serve them. They think they can tell you what you're allowed to eat, or what your moral principles should be. They want to tell you who you can have sex with. What I mean, you can argue that parents are there to protect their children, but we all know that parents go beyond protection, that they do try to impose their will on their children, and it's not necessarily for their children's benefit. A lot of times it is exploitive and oppressive. They may want you to do things that actually harm you because they're putting their needs first. Now let's address the illegitimacy of procreation directly. When a child is brought into existence, consent cannot be obtained because the only being whose entire future is being decided does not yet exist. The decision to create a child is made entirely by others for reasons that have nothing to do with the person being created. Every human being arrives in a world they did not choose and circumstances they did not select, burdened immediately with needs they cannot meet themselves. They have vulnerabilities they cannot escape, and they have mortality that comes with that imposition. In my book, I call this term a life slave. A life slave is not owned as a chattel slave because no one holds legal title to that person. But there is no consent. They're forced to exist whether they want to or not. And then later they become enslaved to the state, but first they are enslaved to their parents. The chattel slave did not consent to their enslavement. The life slave did not consent to existence in the first place. So everyone is a life slave, right? Maybe you can I'm going to get to that in a minute, but you can come to peace with your enslavement and be happy with it. But the bottom line is that you did not choose to exist. That original imposition is a total imposition, and it is the condition which makes all subsequent enslavement possible. The consent problem does not end at birth. The parents, can continue to compound the original imposition through authoritarian parenting by being demanding, by punishing dissent, not giving a child any autonomy. So the child who grows up and becomes estranged from their family because they were abused or subjected to force has no obligation towards their parents, and they have no duty to be grateful. They're accurately perceiving the relationship for what it is, an imposition. Now, I'm saying this because we have been indoctrinated to believe the opposite. We were told we should just be grateful that if you're estranged from your parents, it's your fault. You should just make up. Your parents don't even have to apologize. You should just be grateful because they did so much for you. You didn't ask for any of it. You should not be grateful. There is no amount of money, no amount of compensation that can actually make you whole for that imposition. They imposed life on you. They imposed a death sentence on you. They enslaved you to the state. There is no way they can possibly compensate you for that. A life slave has no duties to the parents merely from the fact that they were created. A life slave owes no duties to the country in which he is born. A life slave owes no duties to maintain their involuntary existence. These duties were not chosen freely, therefore they are illegitimate. Now let's get to the illegitimacy of the state. When a person is born to a state, consent was not obtained. They did not choose their nationality. They did not consent to any of the laws. They did not consent to have taxes extracted from them. They did not consent to having wars conducted in their name. They did not consent to the debts accumulated before birth. Every person born into a state is, from the moment of birth, a life slave in a second and compounding sense. Not only were they forced into existence without consent, They were forced into a specific political arrangement without consent. The social contract collapses under scrutiny. When a citizen objects, the state does not engage philosophically, but it compels submission. The social contract is never signed, but assumed, and the penalty for refusing its terms is violence by the very institution whose legitimacy is being questioned. Henry Thoreau identified the decisive flaw with the social contract theory. The people who consented to the social contract are dead, and consent is not heritable. It is a living act that must be performed by the person it binds in their name and of their own free will. Every generation living under a social contract they never chose, every generation incurs a new imposition to the same illegitimate social contract. The benefits you receive from the so-called social contract does not create consent. You cannot put someone in a cage, feed them, and then pretend that you're doing it for their interests, right? If you enslave them, put them in a cage, you're feeding them because for some reason, feeding that slave who's in a cage serves your interest. It does not serve your interest. So whatever protection you receive police protection that you pay for, by the way, because if you didn't have your taxes extracted from you, you could actually pay to hire a private militia that would actually serve your interest. But no, they have given the police a monopoly on force, right? Now they're going to say because you already paid for something, if you use it, then that means that you submit. No, it does not mean that. You have already taken my money. And of course, I'm going to use the services that I paid for. That does not mean that I actually consent to it. Give me my money back, and then I can hire a private militia to protect me. I don't want your protection because you don't protect me anyway. All you do is oppress me. So, no, I do not consent. Now, I was going to make a distinction between chattel slaves, life slaves, immigrants, settlers. I don't know if that's necessary for me to go into that, but these are three different categories. Um, Immigrants arrived voluntarily, they accepted the terms of their entry. Enslaved people, chattel slaves specifically, were forced into that society without consent. The state was actively designed to keep them subordinated past specific laws, building specific institutions, deploying specific violence catered to them with the explicit purpose of preventing them from accumulating wealth, political power, legal standing. So the state has replaced the state has, I guess, dissolved these systems of oppression. But the point remains: the demand for assimilation is illegitimate, right? For the descendants of settlers and immigrants, they, I guess, I mean, none of us consented to the state, by the way. But I'm just saying, if you want to make the argument about implicit consent, you can make a case that if you chose to come to a country, that you consented to it, right? If you're, I don't think the children consented. I don't think that anybody can. If you were born into the state, then you did not consent to it. Of course, you have to live somewhere. If I were to go to another country, I don't think that necessarily means that I consent to it because you have to live somewhere. And the problem is that every place on this planet has been monopolized by a state. So you can only choose between one oppressor and another oppressor, right? There is no place you can go on the planet and actually be free. But the bottom line is that you can't expect assimilation. You can't, if it's not based on free will, you can't expect anybody to be patriotic. You can't expect them to obey your unjust laws, to what? To feel proud to be a citizen. No, you cannot. You cannot expect anything from them when it's based on force. And now, if they chose it voluntarily, that's one thing. I'm not going to go in detail about the slavery thing because I'm going to do that in a separate video. But everyone who exists now has had existence imposed on them without consent. The question is not whether the imposition occurred, but whether a person chooses to accept that imposition or go against it. Most people will accommodate this imposition, they will make peace with it and orient themselves towards extracting whatever advantage they can from this system, right? Most people will, even though life has been imposed on them, even though they were born into a system they did not consent to, they're not going to resist it. They're going to figure out how they can make it work for them. They're going to extract, they're going to procreate and put more life slaves into the system. They're going to try to become capitalists and see who they can oppress. They're going to participate in democracy and look for people to oppress, to impose their will through violence. Now, I'm going to address the paradox of statism. Every human being, this is according to them, by the way, because the justification for statism is that we're all violent and without the state, we would prey upon each other. Therefore, state control is necessary to contain human nature. This argument self-destructs when held to scrutiny. If human beings are so dangerous that their consent to their own governance is irrelevant, then procreation is not a neutral act. The deliberate introduction of another dangerous, ungovernable life slave into a world already struggling to contain the ones who already exist is illegitimate. Moreover, the state is run by the same human beings whose nature the state was created to protect you from. If these people are so dangerous, if they're so corrupt and violent, why do you trust these very same people to govern you? Why would you give them a monopoly on force, insulate them from accountability, and trust them to protect you? So you're misanthropic, right? Which is why you justify statism, because you don't trust human beings, you don't trust yourself, and yet you're still relying on human beings to protect you. It makes absolutely no sense. The state is not some nebulous, benevolent entity that serves the common good. The state is your oppressor. The state is your enslaver. So this live stream is for those who don't think that consent is necessary. Who think that, for the people who think that force is legitimate, that, oh, I don't have to obtain your consent. I'm just going to do it because I have the ability to do it. I have the ability to procreate. I have the ability to force you to submit to my will through democracy. Consent is the barometer of legitimacy and must be applied without exception. Applied to the family, the authority the family exercises was never consented to, making that imposition creates no legitimate responsibilities upon the person upon who is imposed. The life slave who will bear the weight of existence was never asked whether they wish to bear it, making procreation an irreversible, unchosen imposition that generates no legitimate responsibilities in the life slave. Applied to the state, every life slave living under coercive authority was born into it without consent and remains in it under threat of force. Their life slavery compounded by political subjection they never chose, making the state an imposition maintained by violence that generates no legitimate responsibilities to the citizen. And so, for those who believe that force is legitimate, you basically have no moral claim against violence being inflicted upon you. If you think that force is legitimate, then basically it's the law of the jungle. It's might makes right. And if I ever have the ability to inflict violence against you and overpower your will and force you to do what I want you to do, then you have no moral claim to object. You, he, he who lives by the legalized sword shall die by the legalized sword. Well, no, it would be difficult to do that unless you have some income to actually survive on your own. But the point remains that it's still, you don't have, I mean, there's other things you can do. I'm not saying that you should do this. By the way, this is the reason that I joined the military at 17, because I wanted to be free from my parents. I did not want to be financially beholden to them. So I basically just traded one master for another. I left my father's home, and then I became a slave to the military. Um, at least I got paid by the military. At least the military paid for my education and helped me to, I don't know, get a relatively decent quality of life, right? And that was a temporary thing. I would say I was an indentured servant to the military. I wouldn't say I was a total slave. Right. Okay. So with that being said, I'm going to end this live stream. I just want people to think about it, that when you procreate, you're not just creating a baby, you're creating a slave to the state who did not consent to the social contract. And I don't think that you have any legitimate authority to do that. Of course, you have the power to do it, but it does not make it legitimate. And if you're going to go around imposing force on people, whether it's through procreation or democracy, and if you can't justify, you can't explain to me what gives you authority to do that, then you have no moral claim against force being inflicted upon you in whatever shape or form it appears. You are not an innocent bystander, and I don't have much to say for you when violence is inflicted. It is what it is. Like, this is your system. Oh my gosh, so I'm about to leave, and now I have people coming in. So, also mentioning how it is nearly impossible to get a job now, even though you still need to work to get income, yet there is still all this unique 5 years of experience stuff. Right, that's a trap also, because they're sending so many mixed messages. They're basically telling you that you should go to college, right? That unless you go to college, you're going to be flipping burgers for the rest of your life. And then you go to college thinking that that's going to give you a leg up, and it actually does not, because the time that you spent in college is time that you could have spent working your way up from the bottom. You could have taken an entry-level job, getting some experience, and you probably would have a better chance at success. But you deferred getting that experience because you were wasting your time in college. I'm not going to say that the information that you obtain, the knowledge you obtain, is completely useless, but in terms of increasing your earning potential, no. You're going to have all this massive student loan debt. You're going to be indoctrinated, and these debts were incurred because of impositions made by the state. The state has created all of these occupational licensing requirements, which require you to get an education in order to have the right to earn a livelihood. Then when you incur massive student loan debt, they're going to say it's your fault, as if you actually had a choice. No, get your foot off my neck, leave it to the free market. Maybe I can have a fighting chance if you step out of the way. Maybe I would not incur so much debt. Maybe I could take an apprenticeship. Maybe I could work for free for some law firm and get the experience that I need. But no, you said I had to get an undergrad degree. You said I had to go to law school. You said I had to take your Ragley bar exam. And now you want to talk about how it's all about personal responsibility, as if I had a damn choice. All right, y'all. I am going to end this live stream, but I just want people to think about that the family is the root cause of all of this. Procreation is the root cause of enslavement to the state.